rise and join us in the Pledge of Allegiance.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you and welcome to this special meeting of the Attleboro School Committee, Wednesday, September 9th, 2020. This is your reminder that this meeting is being electronically recorded. First item of business tonight, I will turn it over to the superintendent for his report. Mr. Sawyer.
Thank you, Chairman Withers. We'll have a full update for the committee at our regular scheduled meeting on Monday. But I just wanted to start this evening by expressing my appreciation to the many families who have indicated that they understand the challenges that we face and for the patience that they are showing as we work out the many, many challenges that we face right now. As we've talked about on many occasions, we're an underfunded district. We don't have the same resources that a lot of communities have. And that really complicates this situation pretty significantly for us. And so as we do everything we can to ensure that our opening is going to be a safe one for students, I do know that one of the things that we have faltered on is not necessarily being as good at communicating as we usually are. And that's always a thing that we can work on anyway. So yes, people have been reaching out, they've been going out of their way to express that they understand what we're up against, but they're looking for this information or that information. And I'm doing my best to help people understand what they can expect when, and people have been very good about it. And so I just wanted to say that I really appreciate the members of the community understanding that this is a very, very challenging situation for us. And the safety of our students and our staff is first on our minds. And so that means that there are some other things that are taking a little bit more time than we perhaps want to be perfect. So I'd say it this way, it's probably a compliment of sorts that people have come to expect such a high level of service, and that we're struggling to keep that up in this moment is, I think, understandable. And I do appreciate that people seem to understand that for the most part. So I did want to express my thanks for that. We are finishing up our week of preparations, reaching out to families. I believe in a lot of places schedules went out today. I know that principals have reached out, where teachers are going to be reaching out to families as well. So we're doing quite a bit of work this week to try to get everybody ready for our opening on Monday. And we'll have a full report for how that went for you at our next meeting. I do have two business items that I'd like to recommend for your consideration this evening. The first is that the state did finally issue some guidance around dealing with the child care concerns for educators statewide. Unfortunately, the guidance was pretty scant. And basically it said that they recommend that communities do what they can. I mean, that's just to summarize what their recommendation was. So the one group that we haven't really addressed here in Attleboro in consideration of the state's recommendation are residents of Attleboro who are educators in other communities. So they do not work for the Attleboro Public Schools. They are not our employees, but they are residents, and they are part of that guidance from the state. So in taking that seriously and thinking about what we could do for them, our recommendation is that we treat them the same way that we were treating people who work for us but do not live in Attleboro, which is to say we opened up a program, a child care program that we made available to those employees so that if their community was in remote, they could send their kids on the days that they're not in school, which, again, if you're in remote, it's all 4 days, or if you're in hybrid, the other 2 days, you could bring those kids to school and go to not attend our classes, but be in a program for them. We think it would be something that it'd be feasible for us to offer that same access to educators who live in Attleboro but work someplace else. So our recommendation is for you to consider approving the decision to include those parents in that program.
How does that setup work? Is it similar? Because I know some local nonprofits like the Y, for instance, have set up programs where on their off days, students can go to the Y, bring their Chromebooks, and they're set up with desks, and there'll be floaters to kind of help them, but they'll be doing is that kind of the same idea?
It's very, very similar to that. In fact, I don't know if there's really any notable difference from.
Yeah. I mean, because I guess the reason is if it's a student that goes to school in Mansfield and is going to coming to Attleboro High or wherever it is, what kind of services will we be providing other than, a place for them to come and,
Yeah, it's childcare. It would only be for students up through 6th grade. And basically it's a safe place for the children to stay and have an adult to help them do their remote work for whatever district that child goes to.
Thank you. Any other questions? Rob?
How would it be set up in terms of access to rest of the building? Because there's obviously the concern of making sure as many students are 6 feet apart.
Yeah,
as
so
possible.
we picked a couple classrooms at the end of A building in the high school. So that's already where we have families coming in and out for our other program.
Right.
So they would not have access to the rest of the building, nor would the rest of the building have access to them.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Mrs. Torres?
Thank you. I'm just trying to understand, because we did have discussions regarding doing this for our own staff during the last policy meeting. So what's the difference between what we're doing for our staff, which is they're able to come 4 days a week?
Correct.
And what we're saying we're going to do for citizens of Attleboro who are working for other school districts, which is what I'm hearing.
So for our staff, we're allowing them to be in the classroom. So they're taking actually a seat in the class, whereas this program is outside of the classroom. So it's not a teacher in the room with them, and it's not adding to the number of students in our classes.
So who oversees them?
Certified people with the correct licensure for.
Attleboro Public School staff members.
Yes, well, our Abacus staff is who would be running the
Abacus
program.
staff.
Yeah.
So really all we're saying is Abacus staff would be utilized to babysit them, for lack of a better term.
It's childcare.
Thank you.
Mr. Domenici?
Again, just to clarify, these are students who are part of Attleboro Public Schools to begin with.
Correct.
It's just that their parents or caregivers are teaching in another district. So they are already Attleboro Public School with Attleboro Public School curriculum, either part of the virtual academy or part of the hybrid plan, to which they just have a space in our
Yeah, the
building.
ones under consideration are Attleboro students, correct?
Yeah, I mean, we started going back and forth here, but just to clarify that, it's for Attleboro Public School students whose caregivers happen to teach.
Right.
And may have the same type of requirement to be in their building.
Each outside of that.
But my understanding
Outside of
is
Attleboro.
we're providing this service already to residents of other communities who are children of our employees.
That's where the program was initiated.
Right. So it'll
Trying
be a
to make
mixture
sure
of
that we
students.
had options for our employees who might live someplace else. But now we're saying we should extend, because that program
Exists.
is available,
Yeah.
we should extend that to the people in this situation in following the guidance from the state, right? So we're trying to do our part to support education in the Commonwealth.
Mr. Storrs?
Thank you, sir. Is there additional cost at all?
No, so it's a pay for service, so.
It is, that's what I wanted to verify. So it's pay for service, but so we're really just giving the option for Attleboro citizen parents who are teachers in other districts to pay to have their child somewhere within our schools being overseen by Abacus personnel.
Correct.
Okay.
Is there a name for the program? And I ask only for the purpose of the motion that I'll be asking for in a minute.
I'm sadly misinformed. No, we do not have a name for the program.
No one has any quick name to come up with? No? All right. I'll entertain a motion to approve allowing Attleboro residents who are educators in other districts to pay for placement of their children within our buildings to be overseen by Abacus employees, as described by the superintendent.
Second.
All right, Ms. Johnson,
Yes.
Mr. Geddes,
Yes.
Mr. Withers, yes, Mr. Larson,
Yes.
Mr. Storrs,
Yes.
Ms. Porto.
Yes.
Mr. Domenici,
Yes.
Mr. Hill.
Yes.
Thank you.
So the other item I have for you for consideration tonight is to close the circle on the conversation about extracurricular activities. This, DESE has made it clear that it is their recommendation that school committees make a decision for each local district on whether or not students who are opting to go remote in a district that is not remote, whether or not they can participate in in-person extracurricular activities. Now, a couple things I should preface this all with. One, many of our after-school activities for students will need to be virtual this year. So a lot of them, to the fullest extent possible, the things that can be done virtually are going to be done virtually. But there are some things that we will be able to run that will be in person. Athletics is one of them. Although I haven't had the chance to verify this, I'm assuming that there'll be, say marching band or theater. I mean, so there are some other things besides just sports at stake here. So we're lumping all those things together. I should point out that if we are forced to go into remote as a district based on the guidance on 8 per 100,000, under those circumstances, we're not allowed to have those activities, right? So, only districts that are either in person or in hybrid are in that situation. So, given that fact, we're not there. We're allowed to have these things. So the question becomes, for people who opt to go full remote, even though we can be hybrid, can they participate or not? And, I'll echo the commissioner's sentiment on this, that, every time he gets asked about this, he editorializes a bit about how he has a hard time understanding how it is that school isn't safe and yet sports are, or these other activities are. And I certainly understand his point about that, and I kind of echo it, as I say. But given that we do have the leeway to make that decision, I personally think that, frankly, the editorializing aside, we should let parents make the decision for themselves, and we should honor the decision because we have the right to do so. So my recommendation would be to the committee to follow the guidance, to take a stand, and to do so to allow our remote students to participate in after-school activities if parents so choose.
Did the commissioner have a recommendation other than his kind of editor, his own personal?
No, he made it very clear it's a local decision.
And these are for families who've decided that for either their students or their family, it's not safe or not in their best interest for them to go and be in person. So this is only students attending the AVA?
I'd have to think whether there's anybody that isn't in AVA that would be in this consideration. No. This is, yes, these are for, our AVA students.
Comments, discussion, questions, Mr. Storrs?
So first question, thank you, Senator. These are all after-school type programs. None would be happening during the school day, and obviously,
Correct.
The parents would understand transportation is not provided, period.
Correct.
To or from. And although I guess I kind of see a slight hypocrisy, as the commissioner had voiced, I guess you could say, not those words, but
Not those words, but
that sentiment, I guess you could say.
sure.
I mean, ultimately, my hope is that we are not in this the whole school year, and then it would be a huge shame, in my opinion, to limit participation in certain after-school activities at the start of the school year, and then if we get back to normalcy, those students had missed out all that time. I think overall that's my thoughts.
Mr. Domenici?
So I wouldn't look at it as hypocrisy. I don't think I'd agree with the commissioner. It might be that an hour or two outside in a safe environment is a good social construct for kids who may otherwise have no choice. But to be remote could be family issues. There could be a lot of reasons why 1,200 students are virtual. And so if it's being left up to us and ultimately we as a committee would have to vote, I suppose that's where I would fall. I think it would be dependent upon the circumstances of what the after-school activity is, obviously. But I think a big difference between being in the school, well, I guess for us, it's 2 days a week. But if somebody were in school full-time in buildings, 35 hours a week versus being outside for a couple of hours, a couple of days a week, I think that's a big difference. So I guess my question would be, is this going to be something that we will have to vote on at some point? Or are we at
We have
that
to vote
point
on it
tonight?
right now.
We're at that point right now?
We have the school committee.
Then you know where I stand. Okay.
Mr. Geddes?
Thank you. I was wondering, I know athletics in particular has made a bunch of changes, and I've seen teams like captains practices happening either at the high school, or I've seen cross-country team running all over the city. Can you just give a quick synopsis or update of what you know the seasons to look like as of today?
As in like which sports are running or what?
Yeah, what's going to be available?
So all sports with the exception of competitive cheer, football, and volleyball are going on this fall.
Okay.
The only one that we really had a choice on was volleyball, and the decision for the Hockomock was to push it to the floating season.
Okay. Awesome. Thank you.
Mr. Menchie?
I have one more question. Maybe this is more, I don't know if you know this answer, but for the MIAA, homeschool students have the right to participate in sports, right? Because they also choose to be remote under any circumstance.
Correct.
So I don't think we should, I personally don't think we should punish any of our students for anything different.
I mean, I guess I would say, I tend to understand and agree with the sentiment of the commissioner in that, there are a lot of important functions of schools and services we provide, but the most important is the education we provide in person to our students. So the idea of not going in person to school, but then wanting to participate in other activities in person doesn't necessarily make sense to me personally. But, that being said, I realize the importance of those programs to our students. And I think, personal feelings aside, I think it's an important service we provide. And so, I would tend to support it as in the best interest of our children because, you don't know why people are making certain decisions that they make. Anyone else? All right, so I'll entertain a motion to allow students who opt to attend the Attleboro Virtual Academy or remote learning to participate in extracurricular activities at the Attleboro Public Schools.
So moved.
Second.
Mr. Hill?
Yes.
Mr. Domenici?
Yes.
Ms. Porto?
Yes.
Mr. Storrs?
Yes.
Mr. Larson?
Yes.
Mr. Withers, yes. Mr. Geddes?
Yes.
Ms. Johnson?
Yes.
Motion passes.
I appreciate your attention to both these matters. And that concludes my report.
Thank you. And just as kind of a recap and reminder, this is a special meeting. The purpose is that, those two items and then some policy items coming up are items that we had to address before students return to the building next Monday. So, we'll have a much more detailed report from the administration and other items to discuss on Monday when we reconvene at our regular time. So thank you, Mr. Sawyer, for bringing those matters forward. Next, we have our consent agenda tonight. I am going to read the 6 items on the consent agenda and then ask for a motion and second of the whole slate, and then we'll do a roll call vote. We have a motion to accept the donation of $13.50 from Bay State Textiles, the Hill Roberts Gifts donation line. A motion to accept the donation of $15 from Bay State Textiles to Hill Roberts Gift donation lines. Pursuant to Life Touch Agreement, motion to approve the contractual obligation in the amount of $257.40 to be deposited in the gifts donation line at Brennan Middle School. Pursuant to Mass General Laws, Chapter 53A, 1/2, motion to accept the tangible items with a total estimated value of $995, broken down in the August 18th correspondence from the principal of Hill Roberts Elementary School. Motion to accept the donation in the amount of $10,000 from the Thatcher Elementary School PTO to be deposited in the gifts donation line. And finally, a motion to accept an anonymous donation in the amount of $629.50 to the Attleboro Community Academy.
So moved.
Second.
Any discussion or questions? All right, Ms. Johnson,
Yes.
Mr. Geddes,
Yes.
Mr. Withers, yes. Mr. Larson,
Yes.
Mr. Storrs?
Yes.
Ms. Porto?
Yes.
Mr. Domenici?
Yes.
Mr. Hill?
Yes.
We had minutes from our August 5th, 2020 and August 17th, 2020 meetings circulated with your packet. I will entertain a motion to accept minutes from both meetings.
So moved.
Second.
Any discussion, questions, or edits to the minutes?
Just a nice job on the minutes, especially the 5th.
Agreed. Thank you. All right. All right, so motion has been made and seconded. Mr. Hill?
Yes.
Mr. Domenici?
Yes.
Ms. Porto?
Yes.
Mr. Storrs?
Yes.
Mr. Larson?
Yes.
Mr. Withers, yes. Mr. Geddes?
Yes.
Ms. Johnson?
Yes.
Motion passes. Next, we have subcommittee meetings. First, we have policy and personnel. Mr. Storrs?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The committee met on August 24th. We met in the Library Media Center at Attleboro High School, followed all of our social distancing requirements and what have you. But we were able to meet in person. There are certain policies being brought forward today. All of these effectively have something to do with the opening of school in the midst of COVID-19. The majority of these have come from MASC through DESE with a lot of CDC guidelines associated. I'm going to break down each one. We'll review all of them, and then I will handle the approval process at the end, either all in one or possibly in two. So the first, all of these, I should say that all of these policies or procedures have come out of the committee unanimously. So they're going to all go up for discussion. The first one is a motion to approve an edit to our current policy, ACAB harassment. It's to align with masks upstate. Effectively, the main change here is that there are new Title IX standards, and it mainly affected the investigation process as well as who makes up that investigation group. So for example, on page 3 of the policy, previously it just talked about the Title IX coordinator. Now it's the Title IX coordinator, investigators, decision makers, et cetera. So it affects more. But generally, that's the changes here to this policy, that it's the new Title IX standards. Okay, the next is a motion to adopt policy Ebcfa face coverings. This is a brand new policy that is coming from MASC with DESE guidelines. I think it's very important to talk about this policy, that these guidelines, when we're talking about face coverings in the schools, they're not something that we can just, come up with on our own generally. These are all coming from the state, ultimately from the state, and they're getting their guidelines from the CDC. I will say the one thing that is a little different about our policy that we had discussion about and chose to go with the administration's recommendations was for our younger grades, the pre-K through first grade. DESE's guidelines were that they didn't necessarily have to wear the mask, but CDC does recommend that everybody wear the mask. So ultimately, we chose to go that route. But this just covers the guidelines for face coverings. We have to do these things anyway, even if we didn't have a policy surrounding it. But the committee felt, as does DESE and MASC, that a policy for face coverings made sense. Okay. I should ask, are there any questions regarding the harassment policy? Okay. Is there any questions regarding the face coverings policy?
Just one question, clarification. I know you alluded to it, but I just want to clarify that the face coverings policy, while it applies to the entire district, really the only say we have as a district is as to kindergarten and first grade. The rest is out of our hands anyway.
Correct. Right. So I'll let the administration speak to that, but that is my understanding. Ms. Singer, or...
I didn't hear what you said.
So
Yeah, I said, while the policy applies to the full district, in reality, the only grades we really have any say over is kindergarten and first grade. Because second grade through 12th grade is out of our hands. The state has said that they have to wear masks.
Yes, correct. And we had discussions with our administration and our staff and felt that consistency was best for all grade levels and ages. And again, following CDC guidelines that recommend masks for everybody over 2.
Thank you.
Steve? Hold on, I'll let you go in a minute, Bob.
Just because I can't imagine the public coming to and reading our policy binder. I don't know if you want to highlight some of the major points in terms of, like we reference what types of face coverings are not acceptable, reasons, exemptions to the policy.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. So, I mean, the policy covers all of the requirements for the district in regard to face coverings. That's for staff and for students. It talks about when exceptions can be made. It talks about the times when the masks are not required. For example, during specific mask breaks, while eating or drinking, physical education, or while they're outside and they can socially distance. Other exceptions can be made under certain circumstances by the building administration. Talks about how the mask has to be provided by the student's family. The district is not providing masks every day for every student. Obviously, there will be supplies available, but generally we are asking parents to be mindful and provide those masks with their students every day. Obviously, if the students are in violation, there's guidance for the building principal on how to deal with that. You know, as far as contacting family and how that is handled. Would the administration like to add anything further?
No, just to Mr. Getty's point, there are certain face coverings that are not acceptable in schools, gaiters, bandanas, masks with vents, and that was per the recommendation of our nurse coordinator.
Okay, we had a lot of discussion during the committee meeting about the different types of masks and, you know, how the masks with vents on them per CDC or per other experts are not considered to be the safest. So we chose to limit those types.
And it also does require that any guests to any of the buildings, including family members of students, do have to wear face coverings at all times as well. So
Right, definitely. Thank you.
One thing I would say is that I think it's important that the masks that aren't allowed get communicated to families loudly and clearly, because I know, for instance, gaiters, at a lot of summer camps over the summer, those were the recommended masks for students, you know, and I know it's a different situation being outside lots of times at camp, but I can see that being a surprise to some family that, you know, something like that, especially those are the ones that a lot of kids like to wear. So, and I just want to make sure everyone's well aware of that.
thank you.
Thank you.
Bob,
Mr. Hillhead.
Mr. Hill?
Yeah, well, I did want to first of all say, can't hear myself here. I want to make sure that I understood clearly about the doctor's note.
I'm sorry, there are exceptions to the mask rule if there is medical documentation that someone cannot wear a mask. There would be discussions with the administration, the families, again, are what our policy states, but there are certainly circumstances where discussion would be had with the administrator.
Okay, great, thank you. I know there was some concern. I did hear from a couple of parents who said, you know, the time between now and the policy approval and the start date of school, not a lot of time to get, you know, an appointment and to get the actual doctor's note. You know, certainly attention there.
Yeah, I mean, as far as the policy, again, we're following the mask policy, and the wording in the policy is that, you know, a parent themselves cannot opt the child out of wearing a face mask. But if there is a true medical condition, a note from the physician in discussion with the building administrator will suffice. Good. Mr. Domenici?
So I know we had to create our own policy for this, right? But the expectation going in already was that grades 2 and above were being required to wear a mask. And that's something I kind of wanted to bring to light, because there were some communications. I don't know how many of you may have received them. I had received some where people were asking in general concern about anyone wearing masks. And I tried to explain that like grades 2 and up were already the DESE requirement. So that's one thing to clarify. 2, like the beginning of this policy is straight out of the CDC, because I looked at that today. So like the example, like they don't recommend gaiters, bandanas, masks, and the exceptions for the individuals, like that is straight out of CDC. So we're actually following what our country's guidelines are for this.
Right.
So,
And I would say we're actually following the CDC guidelines a little bit more specific than what MASC is asking for.
and Chairman Withers brought up, you made the reference to camps, and I think it's a good one, because a lot of summer camps, everybody was required to wear masks, and you didn't hear, at least in our area, we didn't hear anything about any sort of issues or concerns with anybody. It was a lot of successful camps that were run following these procedures, including the younger children who had to wear masks at that time. So I feel like our kids are resilient, and we should be equitable in what we're requiring all our students to do and protect every one of our teachers. So
Right. And in regard to some of the emails that we might have gotten, I think it's also important to point out that yes, although the science indicates that certain age groups of students may be less prone to getting sick, these are the CDC guidelines, and overall this is to protect everybody, not just all students, but also all staff. So that's a very important reason why these face coverings are required right now. Okay. Any other questions on the face coverings? Very good. All right, the next policy, there was a motion to adopt policy EBC-S, which is a supplemental policy to our existing EBC. EBC is emergency plans. And this is a policy on COVID-related issues. Effectively, what this supplemental did is it's effectively saying that during the pandemic, while we're in this, it's giving the administration, the superintendent, flexibility regarding a lot of our other policies. So if you take a look at pages 2, 3, and even 4, it speaks to all of these other policies: JCA, ICICA, IIB, 10-inch JH, time on learning, and so on. All these other policies are affected or can be affected by this pandemic. So it's giving a little bit of flexibility to the administration regarding some of these policies. Now, for example, the school calendar is one of the policies that this is called out. And again, this is coming from MASC, and we went with MASC policy word for word. But we all know that any major change to a calendar would still have to come before the school committee. So there's really no difference there, but it's just giving the superintendent some flexibility, which when you're in a pandemic, that's probably necessary. Is there any questions regarding policy EBC-S supplemental? I should say that the idea here, of course, would be that this would go into effect if approved. And then once we get to a point somewhere down the road where we're past all this and we're back to some level of normalcy, this would come back before the committee and we would vote to remove this supplemental policy from the policy binder. Very good. Okay. And the last motion that came forward had to do with a travel and mandatory self-quarantine policy for staff members of the Attleboro Public Schools. This is a new policy. The importance behind this is that we all know that the state has guidelines on where you can go, where you can't go. If you do go somewhere, the process you have to follow when you return. So we felt it's important to make sure that our staff understands, you shouldn't be traveling to those places where the state is saying you shouldn't be traveling. That, you can't just quarantine for 14 days and then do it again and then do it again and then do it again. That's not allowed. So we needed this policy to speak to that, to provide guidance on, yes, ultimately, the state is the one that is defining what is acceptable, where is acceptable and where is not. And we're providing that in a policy format. I don't think we've gotten to a point where we have a policy designator yet, but that is coming. So as far as the motion, it's to adopt this COVID-19 employee update recreational travel and mandatory self-quarantine policy as a to be determined policy designated. Okay, is there any questions or discussion regarding this policy?
Jim,
Okay, yes, Mr. Hill.
clarifying question about the policy with the travel. I guess I'm cognizant of the teachers who, in this border community go to separate states, go to Rhode Island. If Rhode Island were to, become a state that's on the warning list, then this would mean that teachers couldn't go, for instance, if they were from Rhode Island to Rhode Island. That's the implication of this, right?
Interesting that you bring that up because Rhode Island is on the current list. A couple of months ago, Rhode Island was doing amazing, and more recently, less so. So the governor has put Rhode Island on the list of states that are no-goes. But the guidance from the state, and that's what this policy is doing, it's following the guidance from the state. If you live in Rhode Island, you're allowed to travel to and from work. So that's acceptable. So we're effectively following the state's guidelines through this policy.
Yep, totally. I understand that. Just if I live in Massachusetts, but my parents live in Rhode Island, it's going to be a certain, I guess I'm thinking too about flexibility as a border community. I know we're following the state guidance, but to what extent do we have any type of flexibility here, if anything? I know.
And this is a discussion that we did have during the subcommittee meeting, because we were talking about how I drive, when I go past Home Depot, I'm driving through Rhode Island, but travel is one of the things that's acceptable. It's actually the other stuff. And again, what we're really saying is take a look at the state's guidelines and follow the state's guidelines. But if you do go to one of these places, you have to follow state guidelines regarding quarantining. But this is not something that we would want to see our staff doing over and over and over, which means that this policy provides guidance on that. Does that clarify a little bit?
It certainly does clarify. I think it's a very difficult position for staff who are giving so much here. And I don't know what the right solution is. I just think it has real life implications. I know I've heard a couple emails from teachers who are talking about, parents in different states and, what's going to happen and what happens if their parents were actually quarantined and they were very safe and they just went directly to that person's house. They're basically going to have some really severe restrictions. So I don't know what the right answer is. I think it's just a very, it's a tough thing for teachers to have to do given all that they're doing.
Totally agree. Is there anything further the administration wants to add to what I've spoken to?
No, I would just like to reiterate, we recognize the challenges that the staff face when they are, have family in other states. To your point of, is there flexibility? These are state guidelines. These are not things that we created. The state mandated travel. They have travel restrictions in place. We are just simply following and reminding staff that those exist and the steps that they have to take should they travel to a high-risk state, which is determined by the state of Massachusetts.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Mr. Larson?
Thank you. I was just going to echo most of Ms. Singer's comments. I mean, all we're doing is adopting something that's already in place. So, we're not looking to supersede or do anything to procedures that people should be following anyhow. So it applies to them whether we approve this or not, because it is one of the guidelines from the state. All we're doing is adopting this from what I can see, just to basically say that as a district, we agree with it.
Yeah, Bill, I agree with that, Bill. I would just say that, when a statewide policy comes up, it affects different areas. And when you have a border community, there are certain implications. So I understand your point, but it certainly, plays out differently depending on your location. And again, I don't think that's a solution. And my point is not to say not to follow it, but it's just, it's a difficult thing for sure.
Agree, and a lot of our discussion during the policy meeting was regarding that. And I think it should also be, pointed out that this state policy really applies to everybody. Obviously, we can only specify it for our staff members that work for the public school district. But generally, this is required by the state for every citizen of Massachusetts. So, everybody needs to be following these guidelines. And there is obviously reasons why we need that, because we need to make sure that it's understood by all. I mean, it's very obvious that a lot of people, I think including yourself right now, Bob, didn't know that even Rhode Island was put on the list. So it's important to put this in policy so that people know, it's your job to actually keep apprised from the state on where it's okay to go and where it's not okay to go. Okay. Is there any other questions regarding the recreational travel and mandatory self-quarantine? Okay. So I will, so all of these policies are coming for a motion or on the floor. Does anybody want me to take up any one of these separately? If I hear none, then I will do all four at the same time. But would anybody like me to do any of these separately?
I think they should be separate, Mr. Storrs, just because I think there's different concerns with some of them, and I know school committee members have gotten emails on certain ones. Not that necessarily they're going to vote differently, but I think given the discussion we've had and the communication we've had from the public, it makes sense to
understand. And it's only 4 policies, so it's not so bad. And that's why I was asking, because I do know that we've received some emails and some feedback from parents and others regarding some of these. So I will do each one separately. So the first one is the motion to approve the edits to policy ACAB harassment to align with masks. It's already been a motion, and it has already been seconded, so it's coming before the full committee. Is there any further discussion? Okay, seeing none. Ms. Johnson?
Yes.
Mr. Geddes?
Yes.
Mr. Withers?
yes.
Mr. Larson?
Yes.
Mr. Storrs, yes. Ms. Porter?
Yes.
Mr. Domenici?
Yes.
And Mr. Hill?
Yes.
Thank you. The next is the motion to adopt policy EBCFA, face coverings as presented to align with the mask policy. Is there any further discussion? Seeing none. Mr. Hill?
Yes.
Mr. Domenici?
Yes.
Ms. Porter?
Yes.
Mr. Storrs, yes. Mr. Larson?
Yes.
Mr. Withers?
Yes.
Mr. Geddes?
Yes.
And Ms. Johnson?
Yes.
Thank you. Next motion is to adopt policy EBC supplemental, which is the policy on COVID-related issues to align with the mask policy. Is there any further discussion? Seeing none. Ms. Johnson?
Yes.
Mr. Geddes?
Yes.
Mr. Withers?
Yes.
Mr. Larson?
Yes.
Mr. Storrs, yes. Ms. Porter?
Yes.
Mr. Domenici?
Yes.
And Mr. Hill?
Yes.
Thank you. And the last is the motion to adopt the COVID-19 employee update recreational travel and mandatory self-quarantine policy as presented with a designation to be determined. Is there any further discussion?
Mr. Storrs, I assume that like the other policy that we discussed, this is one that once we get beyond this pandemic that we would take out of the policy book.
Yeah, that makes sense. It is very specific to the COVID situation, so we would look at that at that time.
Thank you.
Okay. Is there any other discussion? Seeing none. Mr. Hill?
Yes.
Mr. Domenici?
Yes.
Ms. Porter?
Yes.
Mr. Storrs, yes. Mr. Larson?
Yes.
Mr. Withers?
Yes.
Mr. Geddes?
Yes.
And Ms. Johnson?
Yes.
Okay, all of the policies are adopted. And that, Mr. Chairman, concludes my report.
Thank you. Next, we have our teaching and learning update. Ms. Johnson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to start my report tonight by beginning with noting that the Teaching and Learning Subcommittee acknowledges and appreciates all the hard work it takes to open up the district on any given year in the best of circumstances. That task is absolutely monumental. And during this pandemic, the amount of extra work that has been done by our administration, by teachers, by staff has been really, really exceptional. And just want to make sure that that's on record, that how much we appreciate all the extra hard work that is put in this year. That being said, this meeting was a special meeting, the Teaching and Learning Committee, that Ms. Regan so graciously added to the schedule the night before teachers reported for their first day of training, because there were so many open items, so many to be determined items from the full committee, that the Teaching and Learning Committee members had asked, hey, can we meet and talk about some of these items that had come to closure. So again, we appreciate you that you took the time to do that. Some things of note that were discussed that evening, again, it was the night before the staff was to report for training, and we were lucky to get a preview of some of that training that they were going to be going through the next day that was specific to COVID-19. I think also an acknowledgement needs to be made that the convocation could not be held as it normally would be every year. Every building had to address it differently depending on how they could fit their staff. Some were remote, some were in small groups, but it was still a good, from what I understand, a good kickoff across all buildings. Something else to note is that the registration for the virtual versus in-person really pretty much fell in line with what was expected from the parents' surveys. Of note, seemed to be a higher amount in the elementary grades and a lesser amount in the high school grades, with middle school falling right in between, as it tends to do. We also reviewed the daily schedule, and something of note that we've discussed in the full committee, but I think it's worthy to reiterate tonight, is that whether the students are, and hybrid students are in their in-person days or whether they are remote learning, there is going to be an attendance taken every day. They need to make sure that they are logged on at their designated time. It's very important for this, for our records. We're going to be reporting to the state that attendance record and whether those students were in person or remote that day. Again, the daily schedule is going to be structured to mimic what their day would be like in their regular classroom for their particular grade level. And if parents have questions, they should definitely reach out onto the Attleboro Schools website underneath COVID-19 and go to the APS reopening plans. A lot of questions have come since our general meetings, and as more questions are forwarded to the administration, that FAQ section has been updated. I know I've gotten a lot of questions from parents. I know other committee members have as well. So that's always a great resource for us as well as the community. But of course, if there's a question that they don't find the answer to please feel free to reach out to the district or to any school committee member. Ms. Rickman, is there anything else that you wanted to add? Okay. All right, thank you. And Mr. Chairman, that concludes my report.
Great. I had a question.
Yes.
Priscilla.
Just as the numbers have kind of solidified, I know we don't want, and it's not allowed, or we don't want to have people moving to the hybrid model from the AVA. But if people change their mind, can they go from the hybrid model to the AVA? There's no barrier there in terms of going to the AVA. Is that correct?
Recommended or requested that if your student starts in one model to continue through that model, because it's just like changing into a whole nother district. But if a family finds that they are in a situation where they need to switch for whatever reason, that would be something they should reach out to the registration department, and they could have that conversation and make that happen as appropriate.
But
I guess your question?
No, I don't think so. I understand that it's going to be very problematic for someone to move from AVA to the hybrid model. I don't see it as problematic for some. I'm not understanding why it's problematic. If it is, for students to move from the hybrid model to the AVA. And I just want to actually understand, is that the case?
I don't believe it's going to be problematic, but I'm going to defer this question to Ms. Regan.
So thank you.
Right now, we had a deadline of August 26th, so we wanted to make sure that the buildings were prepared to safely open with the students that had made that decision by that time, and as well as the ABA. We wanted to make sure that we had enough staff in all areas so that we could safely open. So once we're in school for a couple weeks, if a student feels that they would like to move from the hybrid model to the ABA, then they would need to reach out to their child's principal and myself, and then we can put a transition plan together for them to be able to do that within the first few weeks of school. But we wanted to make sure that there was, an ability to plan for the numbers that we had appropriately instead of having students switching from one model to the other model.
Okay. Sorry to belabor the point. It just doesn't make sense to me. I understand from one model to the other, but I think my understanding was this all along is that people had the ability to move to remote, and it seems to me that it wouldn't be that difficult to have someone move to remote. So I'm not getting the difficulty, but I'm open to it, but I just am not understanding it.
Looking is the number of teachers that we currently have in the ABA to make sure that the sizes or the number of students that they'll be responsible for while they're in the ABA, that matches. And so we need to be aware of making sure that there's, an appropriate ratio for teachers and students in the ABA. That's part of the reason. Especially at the elementary level.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. I have some questions. I'll wait.
Mr. Stewart? Thank you, Mr. Chair. To kind of follow up with that, as the school year progresses, if I understand it correctly, the ABA and what's being learned on a day-to-day as compared to what's in the hybrid model, they're going to start to differ a little bit, right? They're not all going to be able to stay on the same exact track as far as day-to-day. Am I correct in what I'm kind of saying?
That is correct. I mean, the approaches are different. The ABA is much more self-paced.
Right.
So I think I understand Mr. Hill's point, which is that going from the structured environment that we have in the traditional school to something which, is more self-paced and targeted for each individual student, the transition from one to the other, it's not the same, right? Like it's much easier to go from hybrid to ABA than it is to go the other way around, which I think we freely acknowledge is the case. The problem is that it's not just that consideration. There's also, as Ms. Regan was talking about, is a staffing consideration. And to be quite frank, we've just moved about a fifth of the district into a school that didn't exist a month ago. And we're offering education in a setting that we really have no idea what appropriate staffing levels look like in that environment. And, depending on who you talk to, there are opinions that it's pretty far in both directions, whether it's more intensive or less intensive. So, as we create another school, we get into all those personnel problems that when we split our resources up that way, it's just harder for us to meet kids' needs. So it's really complicating, which is why we ask people to pick a mode and stick with it for the start, because there's a lot of things that we need to sort out in the first month of school. And it's so asking people to not switch right away is more to do with us getting our bearings and having good information about whether or not we have everything where we need it than it is necessarily about any sort of educational concern. But once we get past that, there's no question that Mr. Hill's right, that moving from hybrid to the ABA is a simpler task than the other way around. And so therefore as long as we have the staffing for it, shouldn't be as hard of a move.
I appreciate that. I think that's a great summary, Superintendent Sawyer. So I appreciate what you stated there. There's part of my thinking that thinks that it's better to get everyone where they're most likely to be on day one. so that in the past week, as situations change or the reality of actually going to school has really become a reality, that it makes sense to me that people would be able to finalize. I know that makes it way more difficult, but I would hate to see, someone is mentally not there now, ready to go to school in the hybrid model. And they're pretty sure that they're going to, I'm going to go for 2 weeks and then I'm going to go to AVA. And whatever they're going to make me do, I'm going to go to AVA and then I'm going to go to the hybrid model and then I'm going to transfer to AVA. I already know that when I start day one. To me, it makes sense to get that person then into AVA from day one.
I would agree.
But is that possible? So people can move from today if they want to, or tomorrow, or up until the start of school into the AVA.
We had set the deadline of the 26th because we knew that as we get closer and closer to the start of school, it gets more and more difficult to make those kinds of changes because we have to settle our class lists, we have to create schedules, we have to do lots of things. So to be quite frank, this is probably the worst moment in this whole process to try to make that switch. But that said, there have been some situations where we're trying to work with people to do exactly what you're talking about, right? These are self-imposed deadlines, and what we want to do is meet the needs of our students and to work with families to do what we think is best for them. So throughout this whole thing, I think we've been trying to do that as best we can, but depending on, again, there's a lot of variables here, right? An elementary school, I think their situation might be a little bit more settled because the scale of the operation is smaller. At the high school, it's a much more complicated beast, and so I think things are much less where we want them to be right in this moment. So depending on the situation, I think we can and have done more for the people that we can, and for the people, we're not promising that we can do anything in this moment, but we are doing what we can do. So no one's standing on the rules, say, oh, no, you missed the deadline, you can't go. If somebody's asking for a thing that we can accommodate, we're doing it.
Okay, thank you very much for that clarification.
Mr. Domenici?
Thank you for that response, Dave, because like anything else, you have to have deadlines. Look at fee for service for bus on a normal time, right? We tell people by a certain day they should sign up, and then we do on a best efforts basis attempt to get people. So to Mr. Hill's point, obviously, and I think we just gave some leeway with one of the policies that we imposed. If you find out within the first week of school a hybrid student tests positive and there's a quarantine issue and such, and maybe that decision is, let's just go to the virtual academy, I can imagine that you now have the leeway and coverage to make those types of decisions, obviously, as well. So I know we're talking a lot about the social emotional aspect of children and whether or not they can handle hybrid and maybe need to go to ABA or the other way around, and trying to accommodate. And we've always been as accommodating as we can be. So I appreciate the deadline. But obviously, there's also the other elephant in the room is there is a pandemic going on, and there could be reasons why people may have to shift, where it may be a challenge at the beginning of the school year to start a hybrid and then very quickly end up having to be remote the whole time. It might make sense to get that person in the academy. And I believe that our administration has that flexibility to do that. So I guess like everything else, it's probably a case by case, but I respect having a deadline in place because you want to have the ability to kind of breathe. Even the hybrid's new. So we have to you want a little bit of time to kind of settle into a rhythm. And I can respect that. So that's kind of where I come across on that, and that's why I can appreciate that. I do agree it's probably easier logistically to move to AVA. Doesn't necessarily mean from an educational standpoint it may be easier. I think that will depend on the student. But I just wanted to make those comments. As somebody whose children will be in the virtual academy, I'm kind of optimistic about what that brand new school for this year will bring. There could be some surprises there too. Maybe the self-paced targeted learning, maybe an unknown benefit, a bright light in what we're dealing with today. As much as my children would personally want to be amongst their peers and in the building for a variety of reasons. We made the decision, we have this, as have 1,200 other people. So, yeah, I agree with having some deadlines in place because you need time to be able to get everything together. You've been asked to do a lot in a very short window, so.
Thank you.
You have my support on that.
Anything else? Thank you, Mrs. Johnson.
Thank you.
Next, we have open forum. Is there anyone who would like to address the committee at open forum?
Chairman, whether there's one person who has raised their hand.
Okay.
to Speak at open forum, this is Robert Burnett. He is from 3849 Central Street in Mansfield.
Thank you. Mr. Burnett, thank you for watching tonight. Please feel free to address the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Is the microphone working? Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, you're great. Thank you.
Excellent. I'll try to be brief here. Over the past several months, the school committee's adopted a number of policies, some put forth by the district administration and some put forth by other state agencies seeking to address COVID, including tonight the mandatory masking policy for K-1, and more significantly, the adoption of the hybrid learning model for the entirety of the school district. Now, these policies have understandably been adopted under the rationale that they're necessary for the safety of the students. And while I don't question the legitimacy of this rationale, it's one that's been proffered despite the fact that public health officials at all levels of government have proffered on the importance of returning students to classrooms, both for their own individual health needs beyond COVID, as well as the importance of education writ large for our country. And the fact that over the last 6 months of data, we've established that scientifically there is no argument that the risk to students from COVID-19 is any more severe than what we deal with annually from the seasonal flu. Not to downplay that, as anybody who's had kids that have the flu knows, that's significant in and of its own. But by the adoption of the hybrid model, we've now placed the burden of educating our children involuntarily on the shoulders of parents, many of whom are now going to be struggling with unemployment, underemployment, and who are facing the reality that they may be under-equipped to fill the role of educator for their children. Despite the severity that the impact of this policy has had on the families of the community, it was only during the course of observing this meeting that I finally received communication from my son's school, which in this case is Willett, on the assignment of cohorts and teachers. In this instance, that communication was only with regards to grades 1 through 4. Kindergarten won't be receiving their assignments until the 17th, providing families less than a week to figure out their schedule, negotiate with employers, find childcare, and deal with the significant burden that this policy has put in place. Furthermore, no measurable or objective standards for conducting ongoing risk management assessments with regards to when we'll be returning to in-person learning have been published or otherwise communicated from either the school committee or the district administration. There seems to be publicly no plan whatsoever of how we're going to measure a return. I sympathize with the district and their desire and the administration's desire to focus on educating our children. But as a public school system, there is the reality that you are a taxpayer-funded public service. And while it would be nice that education was the sole priority, so far the inability to meet reasonable timelines in addressing the parents, as well as providing a concrete and objective plan to return to regular classrooms, has been a significant disservice considering the broad and wide negative effects that that policy is going to have on the community, even beyond the families when we look to the employers and the other services that are going to have to adapt. I'm particularly disheartened when I see that intellectual resource and effort has been placed towards addressing this concern for your own employers and for teachers, when we are providing parents less than a week of notification to try to get their own lives together. So that's going to conclude my statements on this tonight, and I hope that the committee and the administration will perhaps reevaluate their priorities with regards to this.
Thank you very much. Is there anyone else who would like to address the committee at open forum?
Chairman Withers, Joseph Amaral of the
Yep.
Teachers Union.
Sure. Hello, Mr. Amaral. Hope you're having a good night. Please feel free to address the committee.
Chairman Withers, honorable members of the committee. My name's Joe Amaral. I'm president of the Attleboro Education Association. I'd like to speak about a concern regarding the travel policy that the committee just voted on. And that concern stems from the fact that there are students in Attleboro Public Schools that spend nights in Rhode Island, and in some cases, that is every night in Rhode Island. And while staff members that live in Massachusetts cannot visit their families in Rhode Island without quarantining for 14 days, there is no procedure in place that would address these students coming to school in a hybrid model. And I believe that this raises a significant safety concern for everybody in the district. I would ask that the school committee and administration consider policy surrounding this issue. Chairman Withers, honorable members of the committee, thank you very much for the time.
Thank you, Mr. Amaral. Is there anyone else who would like to address the committee at open forum? All right. Mr. Jones is shaking his head no. So with that, is there any other business before the school committee tonight? Seeing none, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second?
Mr. Hill,
Yes.
Mr. Domenici,
Yes.
Ms. Porto,
Yes.
Mr. Storrs.
Yes.
Mr. Larson.
Yes.
Mr. Withers. Yes. Mr. Geddes.
Yes.
Ms. Johnson.
Yes.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.